Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Isis and this is Isis Says Hi. I like to make a lot of research videos about topics that matter to me and babble to you essentially about it. So if you like any of those things, please feel free to subscribe. Would love to have ya. So it's very bright today. It's snowing a little bit. You're gonna get a little bit of light regardless of how I frame this. Anyways, welcome back. Happy Black History Month to all of my blacks who watch this. That if you are not black and you say that, something's a little off there. Something's a little off there. Just want to let you know. I'm excited to talk more about Black history, about black people. So let's get into it. If anybody knows me, or as this channel maybe shows, I am a political gal. I love politics and policy. Okay, I don't love politics. Scratch that. Because it just so happens that politics falls into it. But I really love reading and analyzing policy and understanding our political system and what that means in terms of activism and advocacy, and then also what that means in terms of policies and how things get called forth, not force. Forth. So I'm really excited to talk a bit more about the Congressional Black Caucus. The Congressional Black Caucus has been committed to using the full government to ensure that African Americans and other marginalized communities have the opportunity to achieve the American dream, quote unquote. Some of their policy concerns or things that they focus on are reorganizing the criminal justice system and eliminating barriers to re-entry. And re-entry pretty much surrounds people who were previously incarcerated or arrested for any reason, or people who have records in any way, trying to kind of re-enter themselves back into society. A lot of the time it's really difficult. They are banned from being able to participate in any kind of federal assistance programs, and sometimes it's been so long since they've actually been back in society. So those who have been locked up for like 30, 40, 50 years, that when they kind of enter back in, it's pretty overwhelming. So there's a lot of little things, you know, being unable to get a job, being unable to get any kind of federal assistance because they now have a record, and then trying to just adjust like normal humans do. So you got these systemic issues, and then you just have these human issues that everybody has gone through at one point. That's kind of what re-entry is. Combating voter suppression, and so voter suppression is trying to not allow as many people to vote as possible. There is voter suppression now, as much as people want to ignore that. Some of that is like voter ID laws, so having to have your ID when you go there. Sometimes they'll turn away people for literally no reason. And voter suppression could be like one county having like one ballot, and if it's like a place like Atlanta or something, like that's ridiculous. So these are all kinds of voter suppressions to usually try to get a lot of people to not be able to vote. Usually black and brown people, quite honestly. It's never really white folks that go through it. It's usually black and brown folks. And so that's kind of why people kind of push having that number to call if you feel like something suspicious is going on at where you vote. Trying to have election day be a holiday so that people can get time off so they can actually vote. Next, their other policy concern is expanding and improving access to education from pre-K through post-secondary level, expanding access to quality, affordable healthcare, and eliminating racial health disparities, expanding access to 21st century technologies, including broadband internet. I'm assuming now it probably means actually making sure people have internet that's reliable and that everybody still has internet. There's a lot of rural places that still do not have internet, so making sure that they actually have access to it. Internet that is sufficient and fast. Nobody can live off of 9 Mbps now. That's so stupid. Anyways, strengthening protections for workers, expanding access to full fair pay employment, expanding access to capital, contracts, and counseling for minority-owned businesses. And capital kind of just means money or loans of some sort. Promoting U.S. foreign policy initiatives in Africa and other countries that are consistent with the fundamental right of human dignity. And while the CBC has predominantly been made up of the Democratic Party, the founding members of the caucus envisioned a nonpartisan organization. The CBC has a long history of bipartisan collaboration and members who are both Democratic and Republican. As founding member, Representative Willie William L. Clay Sr. said, "When the CBC was established, Black people have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests." And I feel like that's true for a lot of Black people today, even though predominantly we will go with the Democratic Party because it's better than the Republican at the moment. People still are very much disillusioned or disengaged, particularly after 4 years of the Trump administration. Black people go through a lot, and both parties have done a lot to help and harm us. It just so happens that one at the moment is doing more harm than another. A congressional caucus is a group of members of the United States that meet to pursue common legislative goals. Formally, those caucuses are formed under Congressional Member Organizations, or CMOs, and that is through the United States House of Representatives and governed under the rules of that chamber, so governed under the rules of the House of Representatives. These caucuses are not always called caucuses. Sometimes they're called coalitions, study groups, task forces, or working groups. And we're gonna take a quick break so I can stop and press record again. I think the only struggle of filming these videos, it's having to do that start and stop situation. Moving on. Caucuses date back to colonial times, but were often thought of as corrupt backroom meetings filled with tobacco smoke and whiskey. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that that idea changed. There are now more than 200 caucuses existing in Congress at any given time. Although caucuses exist in both the House and the Senate, the majority of caucuses exist in the House. The House of Representatives, they need to be able to kind of pool their resources together to be able to have stronger backing of issues so that they can make legislation. During the late 1960s, Rep. Charles Diggs created the Democracy Select Committee in an effort to bring, which is also called the DSC, in an effort to bring Black members of Congress together. Diggs noticed that he and other Black members of Congress often felt isolated because there were very few of them in Congress, and he wanted to create a forum where they could discuss common political challenges and interests. The DSC was a pretty relaxed group. They didn't have like a regular day and time for meetings, and they didn't have any staff or budget. The DSC also addressed a number of issues that were of concern to a lot of Black folks. As a result of court-ordered redistricting, which is essentially just, sometimes it's breaking up, sometimes it's combining together towns to be a district. The way they made districts was racist, and so usually that's what the court-ordered redistricting does. Like your school district, that's kind of how you can tell what district you're in, and that's kind of what the district means. The number of Black members of Congress rose from 9 to 13, and that was the largest number of Black folks at the time that they've ever had in Congress. So there's some newly elected members: Representative William Bill Clay Sr. of Missouri, Representative Louis Stokes of Ohio, and Representative Shirley Chisholm of New York embrace the concept of a group for Black legislators to seize the moment, fight for justice, to raise issues too long ignored and too little debated. And the members of the DSC decided at the beginning of the 92nd Congress, which was from 1971 to 1973, that a more formal group was needed. So the DSC met on February 2nd, 1971, and accepted a recommendation put forth by Clay to create a nonpartisan formal network for African American members. Representative Charles Rangel of New York thought of a new name for the group: the Congressional Black Caucus, or the CBC. The Congressional Black Caucus was established in 1971 by 13 founding members. Those members include Representative Shirley A. Chisholm, Representative William L. Clay Sr., Representative George W. Collins, Representative John Conyers Jr., Representative Ronald V. Dellums, Representative Charles C. Diggs Jr., Representative Augustus F. Hawkins, Representative Ralph H. Metcalf, Representative Perrin J. Mitchell, Representative Robert N.C. Nix Sr., Representative Charles B. Rangel, Representative Louis Stokes, and Delegate Walter E. Fauntleroy. So delegates are pretty much people who represent territories or places like DC, which isn't technically a territory but isn't a state. I can go into that forever. They represent, I don't know if it's certain areas or just the territory in a general sense, but that's what they represent. They have House representation, but not Senate representation. I'm assuming it's because they're not a state. In the organization's early years, the CBC adopted a collective approach to present a unified voice for Black America. And so collectivism is the opposite of individualism. So individualism focuses on self, but collectivism focuses on the group as a whole. And so that's kind of what they mean. President Nixon, who was president at the time, refused to recognize the Congressional Black Caucus. As a result, the CBC members refused to go to a State of the Union, explaining that it perceived the president's persistent refusal to grant them a White House meeting as indicative of the administration's abandonment of African American interests. The group won when Nixon agreed to a March 1971 meeting. The CBC's decision to fight its battle with President Nixon publicly worked in the caucus's favor and became a strategy the CBC would return to again and again. In the CBC's 1971 meeting with President Nixon, Representative Diggs said, "Our concerns and obligations as members of Congress do not stop at the boundaries of our districts. Our concerns are national and international in scope. We are petitioned daily by citizens living hundreds of miles from our districts who look on us as congressmen at large for Black people and poor people in the United States." During the meeting, the CBC presented President Nixon with 61 recommendations to destroy racism, provide quality housing for Black families, and promote the full engagement of Black folks in government. They also discussed civil rights, Vietnam, anti-drug legislation, and welfare reform. In 1973, the CBC would be one of the first caucuses of Congress, or groups of members of Congress, to call for President Nixon's impeachment. So the CBC emerged during the high point of Black power when Black folks wanted greater political influence. The caucus was viewed as radical and militant in their approach to focus on the needs of the Black community. The CBC are also usually called the conscience of Congress for being the first to stand up and speak out about issues that Congress needs to examine or re-examine. One example of that was the apartheid in South Africa, an issue that African and African American activists and founding members of the CBC became involved in decades before Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which is for short called CAAA. President Reagan vetoed the bill, but Congress overrode his veto because the support for the bill was so strong. This was the first time in the 20th century that a president had a foreign policy veto overridden. They also were involved in the 1982 Martin Luther King holiday legislation. They helped to change President Bill Clinton's policy towards Haiti, and that included extending more aid to Haitian refugees and placing stronger sanctions or withholding funds on Haiti's military government. In 2004, the CBC also led a petition to end the genocide in the Darfur region of the Sudan. The CBC collected and distributed information on the policy preferences of African Americans, assisted individual Black Americans with a range of requests by providing casework services, and spoke on behalf of special interest groups within the Black community. In 1972, the CBC co-sponsored the National Black Convention in Gary, Indiana. This meeting of Black politicians and activists was a milestone in Black power politics and an exchange of radical ideas. The delegates at the convention wrote the National Black Political Agenda with the goals of addressing the issues of the conditions of major cities, public schools, drug addiction, and unemployment of Black people in America and around the world. At the 1972 Democratic National Convention, the CBC drafted the Black Declaration of Independence and the Black Bill of Rights. The CBC's demands meant to influence the Democratic Party platform and the presidential nominee selection process, included issues ranging from national health insurance to increased foreign aid to Africa. The Black Declaration of Independence demanded that the Democratic Party and its nominee commit themselves to full racial equality. The Black Bill of Rights made more specific demands, which failed to gain the support of the party or its nominee, George McGovern. As an aside, I think it's pretty frustrating to know that you're kind of the backbone of a Democratic Party that refuses to acknowledge you, but you also know that if left up to its own devices, it would fail and then things would just get worse. You should still vote, but I also understand that frustration and sadness with voting for people who barely acknowledge you. Lastly, we're going to talk about some of the challenges that the CBC has faced within its time. In the early Some of the challenges that they faced, they represented only a fraction of total House membership, and it meant that they didn't have a lot of people who maybe could have been in each of the House committees that existed. That meant they couldn't push some of their agenda forward. Next, finally, they got the Voting Rights Act, like in the mid-1960s. That meant that the people who were voted into the House at the time didn't have any kind of seniority because they all just got there. So you got all these white folks, mostly probably white men, who have all of these years of seniority behind them, who are able to take on more powerful positions in maybe committees or have a bigger voice in Congress in a general sense, and that's just something that they didn't have. And then apart from their Black constituents, they also had a lack of popular support. Not surprising, the federal government just decided to acknowledge Black people, barely, but you know, did, right? So yeah, of course there's going to be a lack of popular support. And then of course, because men, sexism. The biggest example of this was Representative Shirley Chisholm's 1972 presidential campaign. That was what proved to be divisive within the caucus. A big reason for that was she felt that not only because of her gender she wasn't getting support, but her willingness to form partnerships with a lot of liberal folks who were not Black to be able to collectively, group with them so that she could get more votes, irritated her colleagues within the CBC. They also individually had a lot of allegiances or loyalty to other people. So if they were to say yes to supporting her publicly, they would lose those political alliances. And the only people who ended up doing it from the 13 members was Representative Ronald Dellums and Representative Perrin Mitchell. I found this to be sexist because if it were a man, it really wouldn't have been that big of an issue. But because it was not only a woman, but it was a dark-skinned woman who is incredibly intelligent, that's just how the cookie crumbled, which is so unfortunate because it would have been amazing to have a Black woman president with so much support behind her. In 1972, no less, that would have been amazing. So in 1975, the CBC sought to create a proactive, preventative method for crafting a legislative plan by balancing collective leadership with individual representation. The CBC embraced the challenge of the dual role Black legislators faced, speaking for concerns of Black America while also representing their communities. Most of them were mostly white communities. During this time, the CBC also confronted questions about its identity and core values. So first example of that is in 1975, Representative Fortney Pete Stark, a white member representing a congressional district in Oakland, California that usually is mostly Black, asked to join the all-Black caucus, and after intense discussion, the group rejected Stark's application. The CBT, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, one second. The CBC retained its unwritten rule to limit membership to Black legislators, but briefly allowed white members to join as non-voting associates. In 1988, 41 white representatives joined the CBC when the caucus instituted its new policy. The decision received a lot of criticism from other members of Congress and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. They have always fought for integration. So, I forgot to record, so I'm using the camera audio. Moving on. My sources are going to be linked down below. Let me know if you have any questions or anything to add that I might have missed. Happy Black History Month to all my Blacks. Hope to see you next week. I think I'm gonna talk more about Shirley Chisholm because I know she was amazing, and I definitely want to go in deeper and learn a bit more about her and talk about her or babble to you for however long. I'll see you all next week. I feel like I'm gonna try to push another video out. Don't hold me to it though. I underestimated how much executive orders and just presidential actions that President Biden actually did since coming into office and how lengthy they are. I am gonna do the video, but we're gonna see when that actually happens. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next week. Or peace to y'all. Black power. Okay, bye.